For an investigation into the use of federal security forces to respond to protests in D.C. How would you like to see Congress address this?
Well, Elaine, you just saw how eloquent the protesters are. I mean, they know their history from Emmett Till in 1954, which sparked the outrage in this country and led to the civil rights movement. And they're talking about policy reform. So it is absolutely outrageous that the administration is using armed law enforcement and possibly even the National Guard or Bureau of Prison officers to go after peaceful protesters. In fact, it just is symbolic of what they're protesting. They're protesting the excessive use of force. So we need to make sure we understand who the law enforcement agencies are. We need to make it clear that the military shouldn't be used and that peaceful protest is at the hallmark of American democracy.
So FBI Director Christopher Wray spoke at the Justice Department Thursday, and I want to play some of what he had to say.
To be clear, we are not in any way trying to discourage peaceful protesters. And to those citizens who are out there making your voices heard through peaceful, lawful protests, let me say this: we in law enforcement hear you.
So, Congressman, in your view, how does that square with what we have actually heard from the White House?
Well, I appreciate what Christopher Wray said, but that hasn't been the policy. I mean, you have the Attorney General not telling us who these law enforcement officers are in Washington, D.C. You have the president calling on governors to bring out the National Guard to, quote, dominate the streets. There is no nuance or distinction saying that we welcome and support the peaceful protesters and hear them from either the president or the Attorney General. And you have a situation of a police excess. I mean, just today, someone on my team, David Robin, was in New York peacefully protesting, and he told me that he was tackled by the police. He was put in zip ties for 6.5 hours. He's taking the day off today because he was in pain, and hundreds of other people have done that. And this is someone who works for a United States congressman. So if those individuals are being targeted, imagine what's happening to peaceful protesters around the country.
Let me ask you about legislation. You proposed the Peace Act in 2019. Give us a quick summary, Congressman. What does it call for, and where does it stand now?
It calls for a standard of force similar to every other Western democracy. I mean, the European Convention of Human Rights, which 46 countries have adopted, says you can only use force as a last resort. And in this country, we're still operating under William Rehnquist's standard from 1989 that says use force if anyone thinks it's reasonable. Well, a lot of times officers think something is reasonable, which isn't reasonable. We need to move to a standard which says you can't use force unless it's a last resort. That would not only save the lives of Black and brown victims, it would also, in my view, save the lives of officers because it would encourage de-escalation before you have violence.
What's the political landscape looking like, though? Have you had any indication from Republicans, from the White House, that there is a willingness right now to pass any police reform legislation?
Well, let me be candid. We had opposition in the past from Democrats. The opposition wasn't just from Republicans. There were Democrats who were unwilling to take on systematic reform on police violence. So I think at least now we have many more Democrats on board with reform. The Congressional Black Caucus has done an extraordinary job. They're going to come up with a package of what we need to pass. I believe every single Democrat should pass what the Congressional Black Caucus is recommending. And if they don't pass that, they owe the American people an explanation. We have the majority in the House of Representatives. Any Democrat who votes against what the CBC is recommending is tone deaf to what's going on in this country. And I believe that then our nominee and our party should embrace the CBC's agenda. But let's be very clear that we're going to run on that in the 2020 election, and then let's win in 2020 on that platform. So I don't think it's enough to just blame the Republicans. Let's, as a Democratic Party, stand for what the Congressional Black Caucus is saying.
Do you think this will be very much in the forefront as we approach November?
Absolutely. I don't see how an issue of such basic justice isn't in the forefront. You know, I was saddened. I was rereading Dr. King, as I do every few years, and this time, of course, it's so relevant. And Dr. King talks about riots back then, and he says he's totally opposed to riots, and he condemns any use of violence. But he says riots will keep happening in this country unless we deal with the underlying injustices, unless we make sure that Black people in this country aren't abused by police, that they have equal access to jobs and healthcare and education. And I was so saddened, part of me was saddened that 50 years later, you could have read the exact same Dr. King speech and it would be relevant to our time. So I don't see what issue could be more important for our country or for November than the quest for racial justice, something that we've been struggling for since our founding.
I do want to ask you about another issue. As we mentioned, you serve on the House Oversight and Reform Committee. The group heard from fired State Department Inspector General Steve Linic yesterday. What are some of your takeaways from his testimony?
Well, I don't want to go into what he said, but I can speak more broadly on the issue, which is that you should not be allowed in this country to fire someone because they are holding an elected official or agency accountable. I mean, if someone is doing the work to hold the State Department accountable to protect taxpayers, then that has to be protected. That's the basic sense of checks and balances in our democracy. And I'm very concerned, not just with his firing, but with other inspector generals' firings and the erosion of those checks in our democracy.
What are the next steps your committee plans to take in investigating his firing?
Well, we plan to hear from other witnesses. We plan to then eventually make public what he was looking into and why there was potential retaliation. And the American people should know the facts. And I'm glad that Senator Grassley, a Republican, has said that he won't approve certain appointees until he gets answers to his questions. This is not a partisan issue. These inspector generals are independent checks on some of the most powerful people in the world, the Secretary of State, the President of the United States. They ought to be able to do their job without interference.